Hello, I'm Eric Meyer, and I'm a developer advocate at Igalia. Before I get started, just wanted to say briefly, this talk was originally conceived as a breakout session, but once we realized that as sponsors of TPAC, Igalia had a sponsor spot, we thought we'd put the talk in this spot and free up that breakout session slot for someone else to claim. So, with that established, I'd like to start things off with a quick overview of how we got to where we are. In the beginning, there was the web browser. But then, soon enough, there were multiple web browsers. In those days, just one person working in their spare time could create a web browser over a weekend or two, and a few people did so. Sometimes they would add new tags or whole sets of tags to increase the capability of the browsers. That's how images ended up inside web pages, for example. It didn't take long for some of those first browser makers to get hired by companies to make web browsers. Others went and founded their own companies to make web browsers. More features got added, the browser space expanded, and then contracted, and expanded, contracted, expanded again. Eventually, we ended up with browsers being driven forward by a very few, very cash-encumbered companies and a foundation. Right now, 3 of the biggest economic powerhouses in the world, and a foundation, employ hundreds of people to work on a slightly smaller number of browser engines. Those engines are largely the engines of the web, and those companies have largely been the mechanics and drivers of those engines. Still, the teams working on those engines have resources amounting to a tiny portion of their company's revenues. Now, the law of large numbers means even a tiny part of a staggering amount is still a very large amount, but it could be more, and it could always be more. The point is, the constrained resources available to browser teams means there's a long tail of possible web features that languish for want of support. Some of them have languished, literally, for decades. And I'm talking here not just about overarching concepts like internationalization or accessibility, but of specific features like timed text, better SVG support, native maps technology, rich print capabilities, support for payment methods, built-in tracking and ad management, distributed web features, new layout methods, and more. It's a very, very long tail of unmet needs because that tail represents the needs and use cases of everyone, everywhere. The unmet needs will always outweigh the resources to implement by literally orders of magnitude. Igalia, my employer, has very effectively worked that long tail for years now. Indeed, we are the number 2 contributors to both Chrome and WebKit, just behind Google and Apple respectively, and we're a top 10 contributor to Gecko. But, to be clear, we're not doing all this for the bragging rights. I mean, bragging rights are nice, but what's really driving this work is that there are needs other companies have, and they're willing to pay to have web browsers support those needs. Probably the most famous example of this is that Bloomberg Financial wanted to have their terminals run on web technologies, but CSS was incapable of delivering the kind of robust layout that they needed, and they didn't see sufficient momentum from the browser makers to improve that layout. So, they paid Igalia to implement CSS Grid in browsers. Now, that was a multi-year, multi-million-dollar investment, but it's one that paid off for everyone. Bloomberg got what they wanted, but really, so did the rest of us. Not every project is so high profile, but many are just as fruitful. To pick one example, consider a smart home appliance Igalia worked on recently. This appliance has a handy touchscreen that lets the homeowner look up information that automatically sets the appliance to the necessary settings, leaving the homeowner free to do other things. It's also added support for pulling information from the open web after the device's debut, which was possible because the interface is just a web browser. It supports all the technologies the open web is using. That screen is the monitor of an embedded device running WPE WebKit, the official WebKit port for embedded devices, which we at Igalia maintain. This means the whole thing runs on browser technologies. The user interface in this case is mostly drawn using SVG, which can be fast and efficient in some settings, but here it was slow. The company that creates the appliance wanted SVG to be faster, much faster, ideally hardware accelerated, so they hired Igalia to make that happen. They weren't the only company that wanted faster UI speeds on a WPE WebKit device. A number of cable companies offer streaming devices with snazzy interfaces, and they draw those interfaces using Canvas. The performance of that was slower and jankier than they wanted, leading to a frustrating customer experience. So, taking advantage of Igalia's expertise in working that long tail of missing features, as well as our experience with WPE WebKit, a few companies got together and paid Igalia to implement a number of performance improvements, from optimizing rendering technologies to adding support for off-screen canvas to WebKit. Now many of those improvements are available to anyone who wants to use them, from the team at Apple Maps to a student making their first web game. Now, you might ask yourself, why the Apple Maps team, just to pick that example again, hadn't already exerted enough internal pressure to get these improvements pushed into the browser made by their own company. And it's entirely possible that they tried, but couldn't make it a higher priority than other things already on the browser team's plate. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. I don't claim any inside knowledge, but it's plausible. We've seen that sort of thing before. Because the truth is that every browser team is constrained by time and budget. They only have so much to work with, and so priorities have to be set and pursued. Prioritizing something usually means deprioritizing other things. The engineer time that's assigned to, let's say, rewriting a layout engine or implementing a new JavaScript API can't also be assigned to, let's say, improving internationalization support or reviewing proposals for new web features. And it might not be obvious at first from the outside, but any engineer will tell you that engineer time isn't perfectly fungible. Coders aren't cogs in a vast machine. They aren't identical parts that can be swapped in and out. Each is a unique part with unique interests and unique competencies. An engineer who's expert in CSS parsing probably isn't equipped to assess and implement internationalization needs. An internationalization expert can't necessarily lend a hand to adding new APIs to the JavaScript core. For some subject areas, a team may literally have one single engineer who can effectively work in that space. And that person, even more than is standard, is inevitably hugely backlogged. And because of that contraction to just a few teams working on a smaller number of engines, there's a real bottleneck. I mean no disrespect nor animus toward the teams at Google, Microsoft, Apple, or Mozilla. They're doing everything they can within their resource constraints. But that's the thing, though. Because there are so few browser teams, their resource constraints act as a constraint on the forward progress of the web as a whole. We can all agree in principle that a given improvement is important, but if it isn't a priority, or it's in an area that doesn't have a lot of team expertise, then it will languish. Now, as I say, Igalia has been able to pick up some of that slack, but only because someone outside a browser vendor was willing to pay us money to make things happen. This opens the bottleneck just a tiny bit. Now, instead of only cache flush browser vendors being the only ones able to advance features, less cache flush non-browser companies can advance ideas as well. Now, that is an improvement, but it's not enough. Why should large companies, or small companies with large bank accounts, be the only ones who can push the web forward? It would be better if groups of small companies could band together to get their priorities implemented, or even if large groups of individuals could do the same. That's why Igalia has worked with Open Collective to create the Open Prioritization Initiative. The vision we have is a way for collections of companies, or people, to be able to help set priorities, collect funding, and hire developers to bring those priorities to life. We at Igalia have a lot of experience doing that, which is why we're one of the initial champions of open prioritization. But we don't envision ourselves being the only recipient of funding. This isn't an idea that we somehow own, or that it is exclusively ours. In fact, we've been greatly inspired by the Open Web Docs initiative, seeing how a collectively funded group of independent, outside experts could bring stability and forward momentum to Web Docs points to a similar approach to adding features, and we were beyond fortunate that Open Collective provided the perfect foundation for that approach. Our first experiment with this went very well. Last year, we offered up 6 possible areas of work for companies and people to support, from bridging SVG and CSS in Firefox to enhancing CSS selector behavior in Chrome. But the winner was adding Focus Visible, a CSS selector that allows for more robust and accessibility-aware design on the web, to WebKit. It's one of those features that everyone agrees is a good idea, but widespread support remained elusive. Mozilla had had something very similar behind a vendor prefix for a decade, but that was all that existed. Despite the clear potential benefits for users and the desire to have better focus handling for designers, the feature had languished. So, the community put in funds to get it implemented, funds which Igalia matched dollar for dollar, and the work was done to bring Focus Visible to WebKit. In the process, Igalia was able to submit patches to a Chromium implementation as well. Focus Visible shipped in Chromium late last year. Mozilla followed soon after with removing the vendor prefix and making any necessary changes. And now, WebKit need only ship the implementation into public releases. It's already available in Safari Technology previews. This year, we have a new collective being funded and worked on, MathML Core. This collective is making it possible to bring fully native support for the MathML Core specification to web browsers. MathML has a long and complex history. Along with SVG, it's one of 2 markup languages that are specially integrated with the HTML5 parser. There are MathML implementations in Firefox and WebKit, but they've mostly been the work of unpaid volunteers. Because of a missing implementation in Chromium, most browser support for MathML is handled by MathJax, a third-party library that takes raw MathML and turns it into, well, something else. Native first-party support for MathML means faster rendering, lower CPU and battery loads, and greatly improved options for making mathematical expressions directly addressable through the accessibility tree. It will also make mathematical text, desired ever since the days the web still lived at CERN, a reality. The benefits of this are enormous in the areas of online education, technical reference material, including many pages on Wikipedia, academic communication, research publication, and more. The number of contributors to the collective is currently small, but they are all individuals, 2 of whom made very, very generous donations to get things started. The current goal of the collective is to augment the partial experimental MathML support in Chromium by adding 2 major features which Chromium still lacks. Once those goals are met and any follow-up work is done, the collective then plans to align implementations and improve interoperability. Should browser vendors have already done this? It doesn't matter. They didn't. They may have had their reasons, but the reality is that it didn't happen. Would they have gotten around to it eventually? Perhaps, but again, that doesn't matter, because we're ready now, thanks to the MathML Core Open Prioritization Collective. Igalia is championing open prioritization because we truly believe in giving the community a voice and a stake in advancing the web. The web is a commons, and open prioritization gives the people who use that commons a way to shape it. We've put our money where our principles are by matching funding on successful collectives in hopes of seeing the number of collectives grow and the places they go to get their work done diversify. The goal isn't merely to increase the number of teams doing significant browser coding by one, it's to increase that number as much as needed to get the work done. It's also important to note that our goal is not to make browser teams redundant. Our goal here is to partner with them and to bring more partners into the conversation. Ultimately, our goal is to make it possible for the Commons to enrich itself. There are many ways to participate in this process. A lot of possible collective partners are in this list on the W3C's website. There are 449 organizations that could, in any combination, come together to add their support to existing collectives, or who could establish new collectives centered on their own needs. If there's a specification that has been languishing and which your industry could really use, open prioritization offers a simple way to pool resources, establish a governing committee, and meet your collective needs without having to wait for browser vendors to prioritize you. Now you can prioritize yourselves. You can learn more about open prioritization and our plans for the future on Egalia's website, specifically at this URL. We hope that many of you will take advantage of this opportunity to enrich the web. It will take some time and resources, but by sharing that burden collectively, you can increase the global amount of resources being put into advancing web features. You can widen the bottleneck, and with enough of us, turn that bottleneck into an open channel. This might sound like pie in the sky, but it really is as straightforward as forming a collective, appointing a governing board, and paying a coder or consultancy to make the web better for you and for everyone. Thank you for your time and for your interest in creating a bigger, more diverse web commons.